Good morning, everybody. I know some of you are still wandering in, but we did want to get started on time. We have a packed agenda. For those of you I don't know, for those of you I don't know, my name is Rafael Heller. I'm with Jobs for the Future, and we are co-hosting this event with Learning Policy Institute. I just would like to say a few very quick words of welcome and then step out of the way. First, just a thank you to Learning Policy Institute, to Shawnice, to Charmaine, to Livia, to Wynn in the California office. We are co-hosting this event, but they did a very large share of the work and very effectively, so thanks, you guys are terrific. Secondly, just a couple of words about the papers that we'll be discussing today, a little background. So about 2 years ago, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation asked Jobs for the Future to produce a series of white papers on what they call deeper learning. And the brand name isn't so important. The important issue is that there's a ton of research in recent years showing that while academics is absolutely critical, it is not enough for kids to succeed in college and careers and the rest of their lives. In addition to high-level academic work, kids need some combination of skills, variously called deeper learning, soft skills, employability skills. Some people still use the term non-cognitive skills, although nobody particularly likes it. Dave Conley recently recommended we call them success skills, but that hasn't caught on yet. The important thing is that if it's true that these things matter very much, we need to try to figure out what the implications are for secondary schools especially. So we've commissioned a series of papers, and I hope you look at all of them, asking what the implications are for assessment, for the use of technology in schools, for civic education, for career education, for how we think about teaching and teacher education. We don't have the answers. Our job is to ask smart people to review the research for us to begin to think about some policy recommendations. Which brings us to the papers today. The two latest papers in the series are both related very closely to equity issues. Basically, the question is, again, if it's true that yes, academics are central, are critically important, but so are other skills, interpersonal, intrapersonal, whatever you call them. What are the equity implications? What will it take to make sure that all children have access to what we call deeper learning? What will it take to ensure that students who are immigrants or English language learners have those opportunities? So that's where we are. That's what brings us here today, and that's what brought us to the papers in your packets. With that, my 3 minutes are up. I want to let our speakers begin. In a minute, we'll hand the mic over to Sarah Sparks from Education Week, who'll be moderating for us. She's assistant editor at EdWeek. She also, if you followed her work, seems to know more about education research than most education researchers do. Patricia Gándara, just in from the Civil Rights Project at UCLA. Let me hand the mic over to Linda Darling-Hammond, who I believe used to work at Stanford or somewhere, but is now the CEO and president of the brand new Learning Policy Institute.
Well, I just want to reassure anybody who might be listening in from Stanford that I am still teaching there, and I will be back on Monday to teach adolescent development to my student teachers. So I am splitting my time, but I am glad to welcome you on behalf of the Learning Policy Institute. We call ourselves the Learning Policy Institute because our focus is on research and policy that support learning and the kind of learning that is empowering and equitable for all young people. Not all policy attends to learning, and in fact, we think that has to become the focus of all our efforts because the kind of learning that Rafael described has implications for the nature of teaching, for the nature of school organizations, for what school systems do, and for what policies have to do to help us become ready for the century we are already in, but are not yet actually fully ready for. As somebody once said, the future is here, it's just not equitably distributed. And so I do want to add my thanks to the staff, Charmaine, Livia, Shanice, and others who made this possible, all the staff in our Washington office. And I want to go right to an introduction of Wade Henderson, who I am so thrilled is here to help us kick off this really important conversation about equitable access to deeper learning opportunities. Wade is the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. You undoubtedly, if you're in this town, know that this is a coalition of 200 national organizations pledged to promote and protect the rights of all persons in the United States. The Leadership Conference works towards the goal of a more open and just society. It has become, under Mr. Henderson's leadership, one of the most effective civil rights organizations in the country. And I could go on at some length about, but I won't, because I would rather hear from Wade about the number of advances that have been made and interventions that have occurred because of his leadership. Wade, you may have seen in the newspaper this week, just announced his intention to retire in a year, but he has assured me that he intends to flunk retirement. So, just as we're in the same club, and so that is good news for all of us, and we'll look forward to seeing in what manner he intends to do that. Mr. Henderson is also the Joseph Rah Professor of Public Interest Law at the Clark School of Law at UDC. He is well known for his expertise on a range of civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights issues. He's widely published in those fields. I want to call on his testimony earlier this year on the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And Wade made the following point, which is the theme of this briefing. So you can see why we need him to lead us into this conversation. He said, "What is needed at the national level, first and foremost, is a relentless focus on preparing all students for college and career. This means requiring states to set and maintain academic standards for all students that are aligned with what they will need to succeed in post-secondary education and careers that will pay a family-supporting wage. The standards, whether Common Core or other comparable standards, must be implemented as well and as successfully in both high poverty and low poverty schools. It is no longer sustainable for our nation or any state to maintain dual systems of public schools, one for the privileged and another vastly inferior for communities of color and the poor. States, which under our federal system have primary responsibility under their own constitutions for educating children, must be required to meet these obligations by ensuring that all students, regardless of zip code, English proficiency levels, race, gender, or disability, have an equal opportunity to meet the standards." Our mission today is to discuss how that might be done, and to launch that conversation, I am delighted to introduce an American hero, Mr. Wade Henderson. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, guys. Come on, wake up. Linda, thank you. That was a very, very generous introduction, and I appreciate it very much. You know, when I was invited by Linda to provide a few opening remarks, you know, to what is a truly distinguished group of advocates and experts in civil and human rights from around the country, you know, all of whom are committed to the same thing that I am and that I think Linda is, which is to try to provide a quality, hey, good morning, education experience for every child in our country. And it's an important goal, and we have to achieve it. Now, let me say, before I launch into this, the Leadership Conference you've heard about, I want to acknowledge Liz King, my education policy staff person, who does such a great job. Liz, thank you. She's great. But truly, the Leadership Conference is a very special organization, and I'm really honored to head it. It is a coalition of 200 national groups over. And we say our motto is we're building an America as good as its ideals, because we think there is nothing in the world today, in the world of government and politics, that's almost more perfect than the U.S. Constitution in its statement of goals for every citizen in the country. I mean, divorce the racial dynamic, the political dynamic that unfortunately engulfs today's debate, and just look at the document for what it symbolizes. And it really is a very powerful statement of what democracy is all about. And if we could really just achieve, half the goal of moving our country in that more perfect direction, boy, would this be a great place to live. And I think that that's part of the goal that we are trying to accomplish with the program that you all are looking at today. So I know this room is really filled with some of the brightest, sharpest minds in education policy and practice in America today. So I wanted to take the opportunity to open the discussion by framing our work not just in moral terms, because it does need to be framed in moral terms, but also terms that underscore the rational self-interest that we share in common to achieve, it's critical to achieving any political goal. So I believe, as many of you do, that education is a fundamental human right, as recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that our own Eleanor Roosevelt championed at the international level. It is a fundamental human right, and we have an obligation to try to accomplish that result. Now, in the context of our own government structure, we are challenged by a frame of government that traces its roots back to the Civil War itself. This is the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, and the debate over states' rights and where it stood in the body politic remains as vibrant today as it was when the war began 155 years ago. And I say that without fear of contradiction, because the very question of how states address public education is framed in that states' rights ethos. So we have a super difficult challenge of trying to meet a set of aspirational goals that are sometimes limited by the very nature of government itself, and we've got to think beyond that. So in his classic book, The Soul of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great academic, philosopher, and civil rights leader, said that, I quote, "Education among all kinds of men always has had and always will have an element of danger and revolution, of dissatisfaction and discontent." Du Bois was, of course, talking about why our nation viewed educated black people as a threat to the status quo. But he was also saying that education itself must be understood as more than an accumulation of facts and equations. True education opens people up to their full potential, grace, and great capability. At its best, it's an experience that enables us to become full, self-determining, critically thinking adults who have the ability to make our way in the world. Now, education is, as Du Bois understood it, is power with a capital P. Now, I think all of us here today understand the transformative power of great education, but I think it's worth stating explicitly. We also know that our current system is not structured for this kind of deeper learning to take place. We do not have welcoming, engaging, culturally responsive, well-resourced schools in every neighborhood, schools that are committed every single day to unlocking the amazing and passionate potential that exists within all of our children. So let me tell you briefly about an experience I have right here in D.C., my hometown, with Lafayette Elementary School. Lafayette Elementary School is in Upper Northwest, and I was invited to come to speak about the March on Washington. I was there. So I was a living relic to the third grade class of Lafayette. So I was speaking to one class, but when I got there, the principal had assembled the entire third grade. These kids were eager. First of all, they had been prepped to understand the sort of context and the history of what the March on Washington was about. They had a vivid sense of where it stood in the progression of civil and human rights. And I'm talking about 9-year-old kids. They were eager, they were inquisitive. It was just a great experience. I said to myself, every school should be like Lafayette. I mean, why can't every school have that same kind of atmosphere, that same kind of passion for, getting the facts? So, I mean, why can't every school be like that? So, at the bottom line, that's a goal. So, and yet, of course, it's not. So we expend great resources, time, and energy trying to build public will for something that should be self-evident. A high-quality education for every single child in America is a necessity. And that has never been truer than right now, when an educated workforce is essential to our economic viability as a nation. Our economic self-interest alone should drive us to make the necessary investments that will break the school-to-prison pipeline and ensure that immigrant students, low-income students, students with disabilities, and students that we failed somehow along the way can have access to an education that they deserve and that makes a difference. So the work that you will do today, let me cut this off, guys, sorry. The work that you will do together today and the work that the New Learning Policy Institute is spearheading is vital to our collective mission to radically reshape public education. It is, I believe, an extension and a refinement of the debate around standards and goes beyond what has unfortunately become yet another nasty partisan fight that distracts Americans from the seriousness of our need to improve public education. So, my friends, we need a 21st century education system for a 21st century economy and a 21st century world. To do that, we need to double down on building the public and political will to make the necessary investments in resources and deeper learning that every child needs. So here's some of the things that I'd like us to think about as we go through the day and beyond. First, how do we reframe the public debate that will help to build political will that states have to make the investments that are required to ensure that every school in America is like Lafayette Elementary, especially when we know that this will require massive investments to make up for decades of disinvestment in some schools that deserve some of our most vulnerable students. And just one challenge, guys. I mean, how do we push that principle in a state like Kansas, which has its own state constitution that says that a quality education is required for every child, and where lawyers representing the civil rights community went to court and proved beyond a doubt that Kansas was in violation of its own constitution. And yet its governor has the political power to cut resources from schools in a way that hampers their ability to be effective. Even advocates in his own party have condemned it as a reckless move. Now, I say that not as a political provocation, but as an example of the kinds of challenges that we face. And how do you build political will in the face of that kind of obstinance? How do we together rethink the classroom as a place of exploration and excitement and creativity for our children? Oh, I'm done, guys. And recognizes that, okay, great, thanks. The intangibles that make learning the uniquely powerful pursuit that it is, and that we still have the ability to know how well students are or are not doing. You know, often the civil rights community is sometimes accused of being so rigid on the idea of accountability that we drown out the ability of kids to have an enriched academic experience. And that, you know, you're trying so hard to make sure that kids are exposed to all they need that, you know, teachers complain, or at least in some instances have, that you're killing the very inspiration that you're trying to preserve. Well, obviously, we don't want that. Obviously, we don't want that. You know, I went to see an old teacher that I had when I was in junior high school. Now, this guy was almost 90. I hadn't seen him since I was in school. I went to see him to thank him for the impact that he had on my life. Now, he was totally blown away by that. But the truth is, he did. He taught me how to fold the New York Times using the subway fold, so I could he did. He taught me history of the Mediterranean, of Constantinople, and the Peloponnesian War and blah, blah, blah. And so at least it helped prepare me in ways that I can't begin to tell you have enriched my life. And I'm looking for that kind of experience for every kid. I'm looking for the Lafayette experience. As I said, by the way, when I finished at Lafayette, the kids gave me a standing ovation and then rushed me for autographs. It was it was the first time I had ever been rushed for autographs. So, you know, I'm just saying, guys. Now, the one thing, and I'll conclude really in the following way. The one reason I did this is because, Linda, I just so admire what you're doing. I really do. Our conversations have really helped me think through some of the difficult challenges that we face as a coalition in trying to advance the interests of improving education and not opening doors unexpectedly to people who want to drive a truck through the accountability system. I mean, everybody's looking for us to blink on the issue of accountability so they can then say, well, look, we're doing it, when they in fact are doing nothing. And so, you know, we are fearful about making concessions that create that kind of political will. We need experts like you who are outside of the political fight to give us the analytical and empirical data that enables us to make the argument without giving ground on this question of accountability. Linda has helped me think some of that through. So in spite of the fact that this is a crazy week for me, I really felt it was important to come and salute your work and to salute what I hope are the aspirations and achieved aspirations of this great organization. So as I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the invitation to have me here, and I look forward to hearing good things about how the day goes. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for 1 or 2 for 2 seconds. Otherwise, we'll say goodbye. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Martha, I should have called you to the stage, right? Please. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. And now I'd like to have Linda and Patricia come up. We're going to have a little bit of a highlights of some of the work being done right now. Linda and Patricia are going to, yes, please, are going to come up to each give a little 10-minute presentation of their recent research. You can find their reports in your packet. And then later on, we'll have a broader conversation with some discussants of the research and some of the implications. So, Linda, I'll start with you.
With any luck at all, we will be queued up, and I will just press a button, and there we go. It works as meant. So I really want to start with where Wade Henderson left off. Deeper learning has long been contentious and viewed as not appropriate for all students, and that's part of the history that we are needing to confront as we move forward. I was recently talking to somebody about a school that's kind of a progressive school that has been engaged in a very inquiry-oriented curriculum for a very long time, and their label is 21st century education since the 19th century, right? Because some of these ideas are not new. But there has been a long tug of war about who is going to get access to a thinking curriculum, to a curriculum that is empowering. As Wade said, true education opens us up to our full potential, that empowers us, power with a capital P. I think that's a really good way for us to think about it. He mentioned W.B. Du Bois. Well, Du Bois was in a tug of war rhetorically in a discourse about the education of black children with Booker T. Washington. There was a very big, it wasn't, and Booker T. Washington was not the only person representing that point of view. But in fact, in building schools for black children in the South, philanthropists were also struggling with whether those would be focused on menial work, so that there would not be access to the classics, to a liberal arts education, but there would be a lot of coursework around literally sweeping and plowing and doing the menial chores that were viewed as the appropriate life aspirations for the Black community. But right here in Washington, D.C., Anna Julia Cooper, a wonderful Black educator, started the M Street School, which was actually one, she was a friend of Du Bois. He was involved in that work. And it offered Latin and Greek and a liberal arts education and an empowering thinking curriculum focused on critical thinking and engagement in the debates of the day. And she encountered tremendous opposition. And ultimately, that school, in the face of that opposition, was closed. So these are issues that go way back. At the turn of the last century, only 5% of jobs were knowledge work jobs. And who got tracked into the tracks for that kind of learning was very associated, as it still is today, with race and class and assumptions about what different children can do and should do in their lives beyond school. So this issue of equity and deeper learning is a long-standing issue, and it's one that today we really want to bring up, call it out, think about the dimensions of the problem, and make progress on real solutions. So what do I mean by deeper learning? As Rafael suggested, there are all kinds of definitions and ideas that bounce around various terminologies. But what I mean here is that students learn content. First of all, this is not a content-free idea. Students learn content deeply in a way that they can apply it, in a way that they can use it in complex real-world tasks. So it's the core concepts of the disciplines, it's the modes of inquiry in the disciplines, the reasons we have different disciplines. In the classical education idea was that each of them has a different mode of thinking and a mode of inquiry, scientific investigation, mathematical analysis, et cetera, social science inquiry. So those modes of inquiry, as well as the ideas, facts, and concepts, need to be applied. An understanding of the meaning and the relevance of ideas to concrete problems. Capacity to transfer knowledge and skills to new situations, to build on them and use them. There's a lot of cognitive research that suggests that when you learn pieces of information disconnected from other pieces of information and you apply that, and you don't apply them, you only regurgitate them perhaps for a test or something like that, and then you leave them alone, that about 90% of that information is not usable for you later. It's what we call inert knowledge. And so we want active knowledge, knowledge that we can access when we need it, know when to apply it. So transferable knowledge and skills. Communication of ideas, collaboration in problem solving, and ability to learn, that metacognitive skill is becoming increasingly important. The demand for skills is changing in our economy. There's a huge increase in the demand for complex communications and expert thinking skills. There's a decline in the demand for manual and cognitive skills that are very routine. Those jobs are being digitized and outsourced and sent overseas, as well as being turned into computerized tasks. Right now, you can have a computer check you out at the grocery store and check you in at the airport. In Silicon Valley, where I live, there are driverless cars driving around. Yeah, I know, it's kind of spooky, but anything that can be automated, will be. The other thing that's happening is that knowledge is growing really quickly. And as a Stanford person, I don't like to quote people from Cal Berkeley. However, and probably somebody's in the room from Berkeley because they almost always are. But so these professors there who are doing this series of studies, and one of the very important findings that they reported was that between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. Think about that for a minute. Knowledge is growing exponentially. Technology knowledge is doubling every 11 months, and that's increasing in rapidity also. So we can't just say, memorize a bunch of information, spit it back, and you'll be ready for your life, young person, because they will be working with knowledge that hasn't been invented yet, with technologies that haven't been discovered yet, solving big, complex problems that we have not managed to solve. So they need to get the concepts and facts in their education system in a way that allows them to continue to learn, where they can get information. If you go to Google right up the street from where I live, they will not use your transcripts or your test scores to decide whether to hire you. They used to do that. They did a big study. They found it did not predict success in their institution. They will actually give you a bunch of performance tasks to evaluate your learning ability, your ability to find information, take it, weigh and balance evidence, figure out what's important, work with other people to create ideas and solutions, test them, and continue an iterative process towards the kind of solutions that they're looking for. So that's what we mean by deeper learning, is getting to those kinds of skills. And deeper learning, as I've said, is inequitably distributed. The challenges are many. Growing child poverty, food insecurity, poor prenatal care, poor health, housing instability, violence, pervasive and persistent stress, all of these things we know from much research influences learning. And one of the things that can happen when kids come to school, there's a lot of talk about how low-income students have about 1/3 as many words as middle-class students when they enter kindergarten quite often, is that teachers will often think, and schools will often think, that they need to be placed in a separate kind of curriculum and remediated with low-level skills. And without being challenged to think. My own kids went to school not too far from here in Montgomery County, and later in Westchester County in New York, where we fought hard to get them into the gifted and talented program, right? Anybody have this experience? I'll bet a few of you do. People are nodding around the world. And in that program, they were using the curriculum. I remember going into the elementary school, and there were a set of classrooms. There were mostly black students in one set of classrooms and all white students in another set of classrooms. This set of students was getting the math curriculum that I happen to know about because I'd worked with the person who designed it, that would lead you to higher order thinking skills in math and to a track for mathematical learning over the long run. The other kids were doing memorization of math facts on timed worksheets and didn't make any meaning out of the math. And they were headed, because we knew from research, to a brick wall in 5th grade where math wouldn't have much meaning for them, and as they went into higher order math, it would not make a lot of sense to them. At the end of that was a magnet school, which divided kids then into a math magnet, and if you didn't have that gifted class at the beginning. So I went to the principal and I said, why is there this different curriculum? I want my daughter in that class, not in that class. She said, oh, you have to be highly gifted for that class. And we test for that in kindergarten. My daughter was already in 1st grade. I jumped up and down. She gave her the test. You know, we finally figured she became the first black student in that track, and one of the only ones in the magnet school later, going into calculus and, on the way to high school and so on. And the resources allocated to those two different tracks were utterly different in terms of the qualifications of the teachers, the access to computers, et cetera. This goes on all of the time. And it's subliminal. I persuaded her that that curriculum had not been designed only for highly gifted students who had to test into it. It was actually designed for urban school students in St. Louis. It had been tested and found to be a very effective curriculum for leading to higher order math capacity. So she said, okay, we will try this for everyone. And they gave the teachers a couple of days of professional development the next summer and brought it to all the classrooms. And I was like, yay, school reform, we did it. And then I came back with my second daughter a few years later, and it was back to the way it had been, both in terms of the tracking and the racial disposition of those tracks. And I asked the principal what had happened. She said, well, the teachers felt that the curriculum was too hard to teach, so we could only offer one section, and we therefore had to track it, and then we had to decide who would go in the tracks and so on. So this happens over and over again in every aspect of elementary and secondary education all across this country. And quite often, what we offer kids is what we think teachers can teach, not what children can learn. And if you look at the European and Asian countries that have risen in the PISA results, one of the things they did was detrack substantially to get a common curriculum and then train teachers to be able to teach that curriculum to all kids. So we have challenges with respect to inadequate school funding and supports that are needed to support this kind of work. Segregation exacerbates everything. We are more segregated today than we were in the 1980s. Tracking and presumptions about what students can learn. High-stakes tests that are focused on low-level skills. We need assessments that focus on the skills that we're actually trying to develop in a variety of ways. And the tests don't have to be focused on low-level skills, but there's an economic imperative for testing companies to keep it easy to score with Scantrons. And so that's part of the challenge. Educator training is always a key issue at the base. The costs of inequality are huge. I like this quote that actually comes from some evidence from Gándara that was published in For Each and Every Child, which is the Excellence and Equity Commission report, that if Hispanic and African American student performance grew to be comparable to white performance and remained there over the next 80 years, the impact would be staggering, adding $50 trillion in present value terms to our economy, more than 3 times the size of our current GDP. This represents the income that we forego by not ensuring equity for all of our students. And the schools that develop deeper learning, we document in this report, have certain characteristics. There are schools that serve predominantly students of color and students in low-income communities that are graduating students at rates above 80 or 90%, that are sending 90% of kids to college, that are developing the kind of learning through performance-based assessments and project-based learning that allows them to be successful in college. And in fact, in a number of these schools, based on studies done by the American Institutes of Research, as well as the Stanford Center on Opportunity Policy and Education, a number of these schools send kids to college and keep them there and graduate them at rates almost twice as high as the average American student. And when you interview the kids, they'll say it's because they've had a curriculum focused on deeper learning, where they've had to investigate and inquire and learn and revise and meet standards and defend their work throughout their school experience, where they have had supports for social emotional learning, including an academic mindset and a capacity to feel like they can grow in their intelligence and in their learning, as well as to manage their relationships and their perseverance and their resilience, where they have had connections to the real world through internships and community service, where there's a culture of respect and responsibility, where, in fact, rather than zero tolerance, kids are taught to be responsible and to grow in that way and to revise their work, because that is actually the way that we learn most powerfully. That all happens in personalized structures where advisors and others are connected to the kids and the families regularly all the way through the end of high school, and no student can fall through the cracks. Educator development is a key piece of this. It's both important, both in preparation and ongoing professional development, to learn to teach in heterogeneous classrooms. One of the things that causes the tracking is that teachers don't know how to teach in heterogeneous classrooms. There are strategies that can be taught and learned to do that. They need to know how to organize well, design collaborative learning, and they need to work in school settings that give them the time and the opportunity to plan and collaborate together, to have common classroom norms so that kids go from class to class and, in fact, they experience the same expectations and the same practices, which allows them to grow at a much faster rate and to understand how to succeed in school. Finally, we identify a set of policies that will be important to move us towards equitable access to deeper learning, including funding policies, both the ways in which we allocate funds to schools, and also some incentives to develop new school designs. Many of the schools that we studied and that other researchers have studied received the small schools grants from the federal government that allowed them to redesign their schools, or used other federal or state funding to redesign their work. Human capital policies are important, how educators are trained, what the standards are for educators, how they get access to meaningful professional development and evaluation, more than drive-by, spray and pray, one-shot workshops, but sustained collegial work around planning curriculum, trying it out, coming back together, refining their work, looking at student learning, and growing this kind of very sophisticated pedagogy for their students. And finally, instruction and assessment policies that bring us to new systems of assessment and accountability that allow, as Wade said, the commitment to accountability and to knowing how kids are doing and to tracking their progress and to knowing how all kids are doing in a way that presses towards the skills that we need and that provides informative information for school people to work with. We urge you to read the reports and to be in contact with us about this work going forward. And Patricia, thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Linda and the others with LPI for the invitation to talk with you for a few minutes about a group of students who I think are oftentimes overlooked, viewed as not having a whole lot to offer, lots of problems, but not a lot to offer. And yet, I'm going to argue are perfectly poised for a reform effort around deeper learning. So, immigrant and English learning students, who are they? 1 in 4 children in the United States today is the child of immigrants. These are unprecedented numbers. Most of these children speak another language at home and in their community. You'll hear that about 10% of our kids are English learners, but that significantly underestimates the numbers of children who are having a very different linguistic experience in growing up and who come to the classroom differently, not in a deficit sense, but differently prepared for the classroom. These kids are very diverse. I'm going to come to that in just a second. But almost 75% of these children who are the children of immigrants speak one language, Spanish. The next largest group is Chinese at about 4%, actually less than that. I make this point because oftentimes this is put up as a smokescreen. In our district, we have 140 different languages. What do you expect me to do? I really can't do anything about this. I can't do regular kinds of bilingual programming because I have so many different languages. The reality is one language is heavily concentrated throughout the country, and in only a few states, it's overwhelmingly one group. But that's not to say that for several of these groups, we couldn't be doing much the same thing. Let me also just clarify, too. These children are oftentimes referred to as immigrant students. In fact, 90% of these children and more are actually born here in the U.S. When we talk about immigrant students, we're really talking by and large about the children of immigrants, children who are growing up in an immigrant household. This is important as well because there are kids. There are U.S. citizens, there are kids, there are responsibility. And I don't think we can shirk that by saying that they're from someplace else. Also, a little bit of a stereotype breaker. Asian immigration is now growing faster than Latino immigration and soon will overtake the numbers. So this is a diverse population. I want to point out to you something else about children in immigrant families. Oftentimes, these children are compared one with the other and saying that, well, some of these kids are just doing so exceptionally well and others are not. It must be their culture. Must be something about a culture of learning or a culture of aspirations that differs among these students. I just want to give you a real quick look at the kinds of preparation, kinds of background that immigrant children bring from their families that differentiates them greatly. Take a look at the children who are the children of immigration from Mexico and the children of immigration from Cambodia. They look very similar with respect to socioeconomic status, the percent that are at or below poverty or near or below poverty, very, very high. And the percent of their parents who have a high school education or barely less than 8 years of education. And then look at the children who are from South America, South American countries, which is somewhere kind of there in the middle, and the children whose families come from Taiwan. They're almost exact opposites. I think it's important to acknowledge this, that the problems here are the differences not about culture, but differences of opportunity. Overall, how are these children faring in our schools? Well, I've pointed out that about 2/3 of them are living in poverty, which has obvious impact on how they do in school, which has been mentioned by Linda. High school dropout for this group is about double what it is for every other group. And those who are English learners score lower on all kinds of tests than any other subgroup except special ed kids. But I want to point out that this is largely, not wholly, but largely because these tests were not designed for them. And about 65,000 students every year come of age without citizenship, having spent most of their lives in the United States. This is a huge and growing problem. Children who were brought here at a very young age, this is the only country they know, and yet once they turn 18, they become extremely vulnerable because they actually don't have citizenship here. So as a result of all of this, immigrant students are oftentimes framed as a problem for the schools, defined by what they don't have, a strong command of English and of the US culture, and made to feel that they don't really belong. And there's a lot of research on this issue. If you feel like you belong, if you're made to feel like you belong, you will prosper in school. If you're made to feel like you don't, that you're marginal to what's going on, that's very highly related to the dropout rate. So I want to argue that we need to reframe these English learners and these immigrant students, not as children who are seen through a deficit lens, but as children with tremendous assets. And there's at least 5 areas, and I think we could probably come up with more if we put our heads to it, but there's at least 5 areas that I think make these kids not only extremely poised for the deeper learning that Linda's been talking about, but also ready to add so much to this nation and to this culture. Let me start just with the most obvious, language. The bulk of our students who are immigrants bring to us one of the world's great languages, one of the languages that is spoken all over the world. Spanish and Chinese, in this case, are the 2 highest. And that's a tremendous asset that they're bringing, along with the cultural skills that accompany those languages in those groups. It's critical that we take advantage of this, acknowledge this, and take advantage of it now, because we are losing these languages in these children faster than we ever have historically. By the 3rd generation, they are gone, and we no longer have this asset. So if we're going to take advantage of it, we need to do it quickly. We need to decide that it's important to do so. And why is it important to do so? We've done quite a lot of research on this issue about the asset that language is. And in a new book that we published on bilingualism, the advantages of bilingualism, we cite a number of studies there that show that full bilingualism, full biliteracy, is associated with higher earnings. It's associated with higher education level. Among Latinos, it is associated with a greater probability of going on to a 4-year college, which becomes really, really important. And in surveying employers, we find that across all sectors of the economy, 2/3 of employers say they will give the advantage of employment to those individuals who are bilingual or multilingual. So it makes these young people highly employable. The second area is diverse perspectives. They bring to us different cultures, different ways, different lenses through which to see. And putting these together, we know also from a lot of research that when we bring different perspectives to the problem, we also increase creativity. resourcefulness and resilience. These young people oftentimes recount to us, even though it's the parents who immigrated, they live with this experience of immigration. They live with this experience of marginalization and isolation, and they have had to overcome this to get into, to survive in our schools. And this has a very deep effect on these young people. And one of those effects is immigrant optimism. Incredibly, in spite of all of the challenges that these young people face, a number of studies now have shown that the children of immigrants are simply more optimistic about their schooling, about their future, about their potential, and outperform those young people who are now third and fourth generation. And fifth, these young children of immigration bring with them collaborative cultural orientation. There was wonderful work done by Uri Treisman, it's going to be 25, 30 years ago now, on which he built an entire math intervention program when he noticed how the Asian kids tended to study together, help each other, work with their peers, and how this was so much more successful in learning than what the other kids were doing. Both the Asian immigration and the Latin American immigration bring with them cultures that are very collaborative, that like to work together towards deeper learning. I want to point out, in fact, as just another stereotype breaker, that we oftentimes think of the children of Mexican immigration as being problematic and doing so poorly in our schools. But in fact, research that's been done over the last several years by Jennifer Lee and Min Jo has concluded that, contrary to popular perception, these children of the Mexican immigration are the most successful immigrant students in our schools because their intergenerational mobility is greater than for any other group. Think about that for a moment. It's turning it on its head. If your parents had a fourth grade education and you graduated from high school, what you have accomplished is significantly more incredible than for the typical student. And so finally, what are the policy implications of all of this? One, we need to build on these children's assets rather than view them through a deficit lens. Two, they bring these incredibly important and useful languages to us. We need to exploit that and provide dual language instruction for all students. If I had another 10 minutes, I would love to tell you about the research on this and how time after time we are finding that those fully biliterate individuals are outperforming anybody else in the schools. We need assessment that is sensitive to language and cultural differences, that doesn't simply paint these kids, again, from a deficit perspective. And we need a campaign to attract and retain highly qualified bilingual teachers. There is no reason why we cannot have these teachers in all of our schools. We have the population out there. We simply have not seen this as a priority. We need federal support for the institutions of higher education to prepare linguistically and culturally competent teachers for English learners. Up until No Child Left Behind, we actually had federal funding to do this. That disappeared with NCLB. We need that money back. And we need a pathway to citizenship for these immigrant students, these 65,000 kids every year who are entering into a highly vulnerable situation, but who have all of these assets that they can contribute to this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. I think I'd like to get the rest of our panelists up. And could you guys slide over a little bit? Yeah. How do I? Let's see. Nope. Are we out of chairs? Okay. I'd like to welcome our panelists. You guys have the biographies for all of them in your packet. So after a really brief introduction, we'll get right into the discussion. So you've got more time to hear what they have to say, and you can find out a little bit more about them in your packets. Beside me is Rita Aherns, Director of Education Policy at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. Next to her right, is Janelle George, Senior Education Policy Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Next to her is Stan Litow, Vice President of Corporate Citizenship and Corporate Affairs for IBM and President of the IBM International Foundation. Beside him is Michael Petrilli, President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And Linda and Patricia are going to stay up with us until, oh,
And
I'm
Laura.
sorry, I totally skipped over you. Apologize. And the lady in the middle is Laura Evangelista, principal of the Flushing International High School. I want to open this up first with a question for all of our panelists to sort of respond to what we've heard. Talk a little bit about the best leverage points you see in your work for how to increase equal access to deeper learning for students, particularly some of the students that we've heard about with so much potential and the ones who are so often left behind. And we'll start with you.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Just make sure you're talking to the mic.
All right. I thought I was actually going to speak last. But so in terms of, I think, some policy levers for increasing deeper learning, I think resource equity is certainly one of the biggest ones that we need to address in this country. Just the idea of having adequate resources for our students, especially those who are most disadvantaged. And I know Janelle wants to talk on this, so I'm not going to focus too much on it. The other two levers that I really want to address is that we need to better understand who our students are in the classroom. I mean, this is, or last year actually, was the first year that students of color became the new majority in the United States public schools. And so we have to address that changing demographic. We have to realize that there is such huge diversity, but we don't have good data on our students still. So we have an outdated system of looking at students by categorizing them into major racial categories, of not looking at the intersectionalities of race and gender, of English language learner status and race, and disability and English language learner status, for example. So at CIRAC, we've been really pushing for more data, more disaggregated data to look at the different Asian American categories, for example. I mean, Patricia's presentation really gave a nice example of how you can have such diversity within the communities, especially within the refugee communities. And so, for example, we have over 1.2 million Southeast Asian refugees here that have arrived to the United States. And yet there is very little data out there in the schools about them. I mean, growing up, most people assumed I was Chinese. And so it was one of those things where I think the data also lends to being able to teach in a culturally and linguistically relevant manner, which I think is another important policy lever, is that we need to have that sort of training for all of our teachers, not just the ones who are teaching English language learners, because we don't know exactly who's coming into the classroom, right? We know that the population is extremely diverse, and so we have to have all of our teachers and our principals and administrators prepared to address that diversity.
Great points. And can you guys hear me too?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Rita, for your comments. And I'm actually going to follow pretty closely on those comments. So I work for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or LDF, which is a civil rights organization founded by the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And LDF successfully litigated the Brown versus Board of Education case. And I just want to quote a portion of the majority opinion, the unanimous decision from Chief Justice Warren, because I think it's relevant to our conversation. In a lot of ways, deeper learning is about quality education that all students should be able to have access to. And Warren wrote, education is the very foundation of good citizenship. It is a principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. And it's doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed if he is deprived of the opportunity for a quality education. So again, that's really what deeper learning is about. It's about equipping students with the skills to succeed in society, in the economy, to be contributing citizens. And so that's what we really advocate for at LDF when we're talking about equal quality access to educational opportunities. We're talking about education that prepares students to really participate fully in our democracy. And so a couple of levers that I just want to mention that we see, as Rita mentioned, definitely resource equity. But resource equity, and the term equity does not always mean equal. So we're not talking about equal funding all the time across the board. Equitable means fair. So it means providing students, schools, and districts with the services and supports that they need. And disproportionately, we see, particularly for low-income students, the need for school-wide services, wraparound services to help mitigate the effects of concentrated poverty. So additional supports, additional services, and also things to help promote positive and inclusive school climates as well. And also really working towards another approach that we're taking and looking at, whether it's current legislation or other local and state policy, it's really helping to dismantle the test and punish approach to really see, without moving away from accountability, to really see a move towards dismantling that infrastructure really that undermines promoting broader curriculum, broader engagement, and broader learning, and really independent student thinking, and really allowing us to have a little bit more space to learn in new and creative ways and give teachers a space to promote different ways of learning without fear of sanctions or other things that might be imposed as a result of that really broader approach, and really a student, and I think Rita was referring to this, a student-centered approach. It focuses on the students, and I also think that this is reflected in the reports, not an approach to teaching that's very narrow, designed narrowly, and really not multidimensional, but that's just designed to respond to a test, but approach that's richer and broader and really will serve students well later in this increasingly diverse global competitive economy.
Great. Well, first I just want to thank Linda and Patricia for their papers.
Can you talk a little louder to your, yeah.
I want to thank you both for your papers, because when I read them, it was so exciting to see all the work that we do in our school and our school community every day outlined. This is what we truly believe in our community and that we've been doing with students for over 20 years. There's over 20 international high schools and academies that work with English language learners across the country now. And we follow truly a student-centered and whole child approach with our students. We use a performance-based assessment system that really reflects the deeper learning skills with our students. So mastery of content, critical thinking, problem solving, communication, perseverance, and knowing how to learn. We also use a mastery-based assessment system even within our school so that we can give ongoing feedback to students on those skills and how they're growing in those areas. The key to our focus is really looking at the student and seeing what they are bringing into the classroom as a resource. We don't focus on what they don't have. Okay, so they don't speak English when they come to us.
but they are fluent in a language that many of us don't know how to speak, and often it's not just one language that they're coming in with, they're coming in with multiple languages already. They have resilience, and I know that many of them bring in life skills at a young age in our high school that I didn't develop until much later on in life. Our classes are focused on collaborative group projects, looking at things deeply in complex ways, connecting things to the real world. This teacher-created curriculum is experiential. It crosses the disciplines, and it results in authentic products that students have to defend and speak about to an audience. These are often projects and skills that are emphasized maybe in more affluent schools, but we know that our students can do. Again, just because they don't speak English doesn't mean they can't think in complex ways and have high-level engagement in interesting tasks. We believe that our students' native language is a true resource and should be brought into the classroom and continue to be developed. They're exposed to English through language and content integration. There's no need to separate basic skills from rich content. That's where people learn language best, is in context and using it in a real purposeful way. We have students collaborate with each other, they reflect on their learning, and again, for us, they graduate through a series of performance tasks, an original research paper, an original science experiment, a literary analysis paper, a math model, a personal statement. They all complete career internships and do internship exhibitions. They have a native language project that they present, and also an arts piece, because we feel that arts is also a very important part of the curriculum and the development of our students. These are the skills that we know they need to be successful in college and career, and so that's what we focus on in our classrooms daily. In addition, the other high leverage piece that I think we focus on in our school is providing the social emotional supports that we know our students need. Many of them are coming from very traumatic lives, either in their home countries or from coming here or dealing with the difficulties of poverty, family separation, so many issues that our students and challenges that they have to handle on top of learning a new language, a new culture and content, and preparing for college. So we provide those supports in schools with as many, in our schools, with as many wraparound services as we can. But we have things built in like an advisory program where all students meet regularly with an advisor where they can talk about some of these issues and get support in these areas. We use a restorative justice approach with students and restorative practices throughout all of our work. And we have many partnerships with outside organizations and CBOs. We really, you know, it's funny that you talk about not belonging, because I feel like one of the things, there's a giant mural that our students created in our doorway, and it says, "Where we belong." And that's what we really try to do at our schools, create that culture of belonging for students, because we know that once we feel that they belong, they're going to stay with us, you know, and then we can do the work and the skill building that they really need for beyond our doors. We know that this cannot be developed without developing our staffs. And so there's real capacity work that has to happen with teachers, and that has to happen in a collaborative way, just the way that Linda described, where teachers are looking at work, giving each other feedback, trying things out and not afraid to make mistakes, and working together to develop these complex tasks and curriculum. And you know, I'm here because I really want to tell you that this is possible and it works, and we've been doing this for a long time. You know, in New York State, it's, you know, they struggle to get 35% of their L's to graduate within 4 years. And at my school and across our schools, we regularly graduate students in 4 years at a 70% graduation rate. And when we're looking at 5 and 6 years, we're in the high 80s. All of our students apply to college and are accepted to college. Many of them enroll. You know, again, some of them have to wait because maybe they may be undocumented and, you know, financial issues. But many of them go on to college and are successful there. And this is just, I wish I could see this more broadly in more schools, because I know every day that our students can do this work.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about economic opportunity, and it relates directly to the papers that were presented. I work for the IBM company now. I was Deputy Chancellor of Schools in New York City, I did run an advocacy organization. I did work for the mayor. I did work for the governor. But from the standpoint of a large company and U.S. competitiveness, we really cannot wait in terms of solving the problem of providing more equal opportunity for more young people. And there is a role that the business community can play. It's interesting because when I was preparing for IBM's centennial a couple of years ago, I went into the archives, and there's a very interesting story about how IBM opened its first manufacturing plant in Lexington, Kentucky, which was segregated below the Mason-Dixon line. There were no integrated work opportunities in that part of the United States. And at that point, the CEO of the IBM company, in correspondence with the governor, indicated if the plant wasn't going to be integrated, the plant would be in California. And he relented. The plant opened. It was integrated. And the schools in Lexington, Kentucky were integrated in 1955 before the Civil Rights Act. So that was an activity that was based upon an important transformative action, but it was based upon an economic imperative because the company thought at that point that it was important that they be able to attract large numbers of people in a variety of different racial and ethnic groups. And it would be a mistake to do this in one part of the country different from the large corporate policy across the United States. So here we are now in the 21st century, and we look at our workforce and our needs. And the technology community in the United States is not well representing low income and students and young people of color. That's just the fact. We do better than any other technology company in the United States, but we don't do good enough. And we're not going to be able to recruit waiting for students at the top and then looking at the cream and seeing how much of the cream you can attract compared with a variety of other companies. So we determined that we would need to focus in on high school transformation. And what we did it is through a program called P-TECH. We started with one school in Crown Heights across from Albany Houses, which is the toughest public housing project in the city of New York from the standpoint of crime and drugs. And we opened this school, P-TECH, in the fall of 2011. And it was important. It's not a charter school. There's no exam to get in. It's an open enrollment program. 90% of the students are free lunch eligible. All of them are children of color. It has the highest percentage of African American male students of any school, not just high school, in the entire city of New York. And the results are that at the end of 4 years, 6 of the students actually completed their high school degree and their associate's degree in computer science. All got job offers from IBM. Half of them accepted them. The other half went on and took full scholarships to four-year institutions. At the end of year 5, about 35% of the students will complete 5 years or less their 6-year program. All of them will get job offers. Their grade point averages on college courses, 50% of the courses, they either got an A or a B. That's better than the rates for all students in the City University of New York. As you probably know, graduates of the New York City public schools who go to colleges in New York City in the CUNY system, 80% take remedial courses. None of the students at P-TECH take remedial courses. So there are now 40 P-TECH schools across 3 states. In September, it'll be up to 65 across 6 states, and the first sites opening outside of the US and Australia. So what's different? It relates directly to the research papers that we reviewed. Number one, we look at the workplace skills that are critically important for jobs at IBM, and we embed them directly in the curriculum. This is not your grandmother's vocational education. This is an opportunity to say there are certain skills, some people used to call them soft skills. We like to refer them as essential skills, and they're about problem solving, they're about writing, they're about presentation, they're about collaboration, and they're embedded in every course. So if you went to P-TECH and you went into the algebra class, you wouldn't recognize it because the students would be presenting, writing, collaborating, problem solving in every single course. Every student gets a mentor. We train all the mentors through an electronic site that we created called Mentor Place to make the mentoring directly connected to academic experiences. Every student gets a paid internship. The interns get paid $12 to $14 an hour. They work and prepare about 3 months for their internships. The evaluation that we did of managers for the interns demonstrated that their job skills and performance was equal to juniors in college, even though this was the summer between their junior and senior year in high school. And then when they complete with their associate's degree, they're guaranteed first in line for jobs at IBM. Now, why is it first in line as opposed to a guaranteed job? Because our lawyers said you can't guarantee a job. On the other hand, every single student who has the skill will get a job. Now there are 80 other companies sort of following this model. Why is this important? It's important because in 1970, 6% of low-income students at age 24 had a college degree, and 45 years later it went to 9%. So it's just not working. Only 6% of low-income students at the end of 6 years get a STEM job. That's where the high wages are. That's where the real economic opportunity is. So it's just not working. Now, the students that we hire with their associate's degree in computer science, their starting salary is $53,000 a year. They all got $1,000 signing bonuses when they start, and they're doing great. It's a career opportunity, and it's a real pipeline. We're not looking at students who finish high school, go on to college. We're creating an integrated experience. And that's why I think it's important, because if you look at the slide that was up there on the economics of it, by increasing college completion, not high school diplomas, college completion, you're going to create larger and larger numbers of students who can get high-paying jobs. And we're not talking about preparing students for one job. We're talking about a career ladder and opportunity. Now, the young people who will come to IBM to work with their associate's degree, if they want to go on and get their bachelor's degree, that's great. We'll pay for it. That's an opportunity for young people that they don't have. So I don't think it is good for us to focus in on only a top-tier number of students to provide real economic opportunity. For the U.S. to be economically competitive, we have to significantly increase the number of young people who not complete high school, but complete college and are career ready. And that's what this is about.
Great.
Thanks, Mike.
Ooh, that's a tough act to follow. I love BTEC, such an amazing program. Incredible work, Stanford. So first of all, I should say that when Linda asked me if I would speak, I admitted to her that I was a little bit skeptical about deep learning, at least how it is sometimes communicated. But I agreed to do it for one reason, is because I want Linda to owe me one. And that's because my young boys, 5 and 8, really want to meet her son, who was on American Ninja Warrior, and was amazing. I mean, if anybody's seen it, you should go Google this.
I am glad to be known as his mother.
So I hope we can maybe arrange that later.
Yeah,
because,
we'll work it out.
Very inspired
He's
by
here in
his,
D.C.
Obstacle course abilities. Not to mention, he's also incredible log clerk, et cetera, et cetera. I do have some skepticism about some of what we've heard today, but first let's focus on some common ground, which is that throughout the K-12 system, we can all agree that what many kids are getting is terrible, right? Is way too boring, is way too low level, is not challenging. You know, when we look at elementary schools, Linda was exactly right. You see these schools that are doing this so-called remedial education that not only is boring and not motivating, it doesn't work, right? And I think we can find some real common cause around the elementary school curriculum and say, when kids come to school, and particularly low-income kids, we talk about the vocabulary gap. You know, what works to fill that gap is not to suddenly do a bunch of flashcards and teach them vocabulary, right? It's to teach them a content-rich curriculum. Yeah. And it was great to hear this definition of deeper learning as putting content front and center, because I would argue, especially in the elementary school, that is what is so essential if we're going to dramatically change these numbers that stay on top. That the reason that many kids are not learning to read, in particular, it is no longer because they're not learning to decode. We've gotten a lot better at that. That's good. That's good news. A lot of those reading wars back in the late 90s, those are over. We now do a better job helping most that many young people do not have the access to learning about history, about science, about art, music, and literature, so that then when they pick up a piece of text, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, they can't make sense of it. And so the Common Core standards and other high-quality standards are very clear. They say what we need in our elementary school curriculum, therefore, is a content-rich curriculum. To go back to elementary school teachers being, as David Coleman says, the guide to the universe for these young people who are, as Wade Henderson said so eloquently, so eager to hear about history, to hear these stories about our heroes from the past, to hear about faraway places, to learn about science, and to learn about the way the world works. They are eager. And yet, what are we doing in those elementary schools, right? Minutes a day teaching history, or social studies, or science, or art, or music. Minutes. What are they doing, right? Instead, we're endlessly teaching these so-called, comprehension strategies. Find the main idea of this text. How boring, right? And it's not working. So I think we can find some real common cause there. And likewise in the high schools, when you just see these kids going through this death march of one boring class after another, right? I mean, clearly we can do better than this. What makes me nervous about some of the way deeper learning is sometimes talked about is a couple of things. First of all, I think we really do have to differentiate between elementary schools and secondary schools. And I think a lot of this conversation is about secondary schools and makes a lot of sense there. In elementary school, again, I really think that the balance between, say, teaching kids the content and then the focus on the application or the project-based learning, all of that, my read of the research is that the focus has to be very heavily on the content. By all means, we can have little kids, too, figure out how to apply what they learn. And I hope that at Lafayette Elementary School, after they got Wade Henderson's signature, there were different ways for them to apply what they learned about the civil rights movement. But before they can apply it, they've got to learn it, right? And we continue to skip that step. And particularly for little kids, I think that's essential. We can't let go of it. And that's extremely important. The other thing that I think we need to focus on is rather than jumping to a particular approach to teaching and learning, a particular mix of different pedagogies, at least from a policy perspective, and I am a policy guy, I'm a policy wonk, I think the focus has got to be on long-term outcomes. What we're trying to do is help many, many, many more low-income kids grow up to climb the ladder to the middle class, right, and to have economic opportunity, to interrupt intergenerational poverty. And so I think the question we have to constantly ask ourselves is, does this approach work in getting those young people on a pathway where they can be successful? And my sense is that once you're talking about high school, I think something like P-TECH works great. I think the kind of school that we're hearing about from Lara sounds great. I don't think that means that every single high school has to look exactly like that. I love what's happened in New York City in the last 10 years with the small schools movement, where you have hundreds of different schools, all of them small, but in lots of different flavors. Some of them would probably match up better with this definition of deeper learning. Most of them probably would, but some might look a little different. Some might be more traditionally academic, saying, we are going to prepare kids overwhelmingly for the traditional college experience. And if they do that really well, fantastic. So I just think we need to keep the focus on the long-term outcome, which is that for most low-income kids to have opportunity, they need some kind of post-secondary. That means either technical credentials, that means either academic credentials, and keep pushing ourselves to say, what mix of these different approaches works best? And it's not going to look the same for everybody, and we shouldn't try to say that because some of these, quote, deeper learning high schools are really exciting and promising, that therefore every single high school in the country has to look exactly like that. I think what we need to ask is, how are we designing high schools to be engaging and to help young people on their path?
I think Linda, I think you wanted to respond.
And then maybe Patricia will have. We'll turn that down a little bit. I just wanted to pull out a couple of policy threads from some of this conversation, because when you hear about the great work at international high schools, which it turned out Patricia and I both wrote about in our papers, not knowing that the other was doing so because they're so successful, the P-TECH schools and so on. What are some of the policy implications of this? And I think to Mike's point, the question about what do kids get access to in terms of curriculum is a key issue. There was a lot of research done during the last decade about how, with the high stakes testing around English and math, a lot of schools, particularly low income schools, got rid of science, got rid of history, or really squeezed it down to the minutes a day. The arts left, the libraries disappeared because fiscal budget cuts were converging with the pressure to get scores up on reading and math tests. E.D. Hirsch at the Core Knowledge Foundation made the point years ago, which Mike was reprising for us, which is a really important one, that you actually learn to read by knowing about the content. It's your life experience and your content knowledge that allows you to develop the literacy skills. So losing that rich curriculum has been a challenge. And one of the policy issues we have is to replace a full rich curriculum in all of our schools and make sure that kids are getting access to all the different disciplines and the ways in which we learn, which are, as I said, sort of modes of inquiry in and of themselves. And then doing that in a way that what they're learning is applied. And your comments, Mike, made me think about the core knowledge schools, which I've seen in a number of states, which have wonderful, applications of deep knowledge that they're engaging in. So then how do we get to that? Well, we have to rethink accountability in a couple of ways, and I just wanted to mention one or two things that are emerging. A number of states are going to more of a multiple measures approach to accountability, where they include a variety of kinds of academic outcome measures, sometimes tests that are emerging to be more thoughtful and open-ended and calling on more problem-solving and critical thinking abilities, along with English proficiency gains, along with, it would be nice if everybody had a bilingual seal of literacy, as California has, which is another way to maintain both. 11 other states, that's great to know. But we're also in California, for example, in that system, measuring the number of kids who complete high school, having succeeded in a college-ready curriculum and having completed a whole sequence in a career technical, high-quality curriculum that meets a set of standards. We're looking at whether schools are offering a rich curriculum as an accountability measure, because we have reason to believe it will translate into these other outcomes. So I think as we worry about how to scale up these great programs, we should begin to think about what will be the new levers for encouraging states and local communities to really tackle these issues that we know are important.
Well, I have a suggestion. Right now in the United States, we fund all career and technical education through something called the Perkins Act. And it distributes about $1.3 billion around the United States, and it goes out purely on a population basis. So if you have lousy programs, you get the same amount of money next year that you did the year before based upon population. There is a movement to reauthorize Perkins and to change how the money goes out. And instead of saying just based upon population, you should get it if you link your programs to labor market information, like where the jobs are. That might threaten some cosmetology programs, but that might be okay.
Not in Hollywood.
Number two,
grow those programs.
Number two, to be able to have some metrics for performance. Number three, to align your high school program to your college program, so you're actually creating a scope and sequence that's going to lead to a degree. Have real employer engagement and involvement in the program, and the coalition that signed up behind it includes all the business organizations, but also the NAACP, student organizations like Young Invincibles, the labor organizations like the AFT and the AFL-CIO. It's a coalition of about 350 or 400 organizations. When you talk about going to scale, can we get from 65 P-TECH schools to 200 or 300? Yes, we can, but that's not a solution to the problem. If you change how the federal dollars go down, and you create an incentive for people to do different, then you won't have the same vocational education programs that you had. When I walked out of the New York City public schools as deputy chancellor in the early 90s, about over 20 years ago, when we began the process of creating P-TECH in New York City, I looked at all the vocational programs. 95% of them were exactly the same as when I left. Yeah. Now, why would you do that if the entire economic structure in the United States was changing? You can't do it without adapting, and that's what I think changes in Perkins
And to your
would do.
point about wanting to hire, young people in the business, there are a lot of U.S. companies that would like to be able to hire more U.S. students and are tapping global marketplaces. I was with yesterday an former executive from Cisco, who said that's our goal, is that we can begin to hire more U.S. students rather than having to fight for H-1 visas, which in California, in one day, all the visas for the year are gone. And there's a line of companies, trying to get more.
I want to pull back a little bit because I was really struck when you were speaking about going back after you thought you had made great reforms in your school, and it turned out that the teachers weren't ready to do it, and so it all kind of collapsed back to exactly the same tracking you had seen when you initially came in. And we've now had 15 years, we've had a couple generations of teachers now trained and coming in an accountability system, a curriculum system that is much more focused on not necessarily the deeper learning, not necessarily drawing in a whole lot of different content. And while we're starting to look at that again, I'm interested in what supports are needed for teaching capacity to actually prepare the teachers to carry those reforms forward. I'd like if you could talk a little bit about what you see.
I mean, in terms of what's needed to support the teachers, I mean, the ongoing professional development has to be, as was discussed, meaningful and collaborative and really reflect the students' needs, right? It has to be student-focused. Who's in the classroom? Teaching like was mentioned, a heterogeneous classroom, right? So a lot of folks, I mean, as I was a teacher, and I remember I was not prepared at all for the students that came into my classroom from very low-income families who thought that they could not survive or live past the age of 18, right? I was not prepared for that. That's something that, could have been, that I needed professional development on, right? Is teaching to those students in terms of supporting them emotionally, supporting their needs that are brought in from outside of the classroom. The majority of our students now are low income, and they're very diverse. And we need to have the teacher preparation and the professional development address that. How do we teach so that we could accelerate learning quickly and rapidly in every single classroom, right? It's not, you can't expect to not have a high-needs student coming into your classroom. So we have to change that professional development to reflect that.
Laura, could you talk a little bit about how the process of evaluating students in this competency-based and project-based format in their school, how that allows a different kind of professional development for your teachers?
I mean, I myself was a teacher in one of our schools for many years. And I always say that for me, the process of evaluating students through our performance assessments was the greatest professional development that I ever received. To have to sit with my peers, often looking at my own work that I used with students, my own activities and scaffolds that I was working with students in order to prepare them for this work. To sit down, look at the students' work, norm across common rubrics, which we've developed across all of our schools and are aligned to the Common Core standards. That forced me to think back and reflect on my own practice and what I was doing in my classroom to prepare students. And I wasn't teaching in isolation. I mean, we were all looking at each other's work all the time, and there's no greater accountability than that, and to sit with your peers and think to yourself, you know what, I didn't do right by this student. I could have done more. And so that's built into everything we do. I mean, one of our core principles is at our schools is one learning model for all. So we ask teachers to do what we ask students to do, work together in groups, think deeply. I mean, we continue to develop the deeper learning in our own staffs as we're doing it with our students. so that they're then working with students to build in those reflective practices, to think about how to keep improving. I mean, this work is not, it's very complex, it's not easy, and it needs continual development and revision, just like our students are doing. And so it's built into our structures. We have we consider all of our collaborative time as ongoing professional development. And you use our budget to make sure that we've created schedules where teachers can meet regularly and do, talk about their work beyond just when they're sitting on panels and students are defending their work. Before that whole process, how are we getting students ready for that culminating piece?
And Patricia, you wanted to respond to that?
Commonly, the response to what do we do about the teachers and bringing them up to speed on these things, the response to that is professional development. But I'm afraid we don't interrogate enough where does the professional development come from? Right. And if we're not investing, if at state and federal level we're not investing in building this knowledge in our institutions of higher ed that are producing the teachers in the first place, we don't have the folks out there to provide the appropriate professional development. I think we need to go back to that, looking at what we're not doing about investing in developing those kinds of skills. A lot of money gets spent on professional development for things that I'm not sure are really all that useful. And I think there really needs to be a refocus on the preparation of folks the research base and the preparation of folks who can do it well. We recently were surveying teachers we do this periodically, we were recently surveying teachers in the Los Angeles school district around their skills and how prepared they felt to teach diverse students, particularly linguistically diverse students. Overwhelmingly, they told us, we haven't gotten the preparation for doing this. I left my teacher preparation program without these skills, and now I am scrambling to try to get them.
I just want to piggyback on that and say that one of the key pieces of this, Deborah Ball has coined a phrase that you learn about practice in practice. But you don't learn about practice in practice by yourself by trial and error. You learn from expert teachers who already know. And so this is an issue for both pre-service and for the way we structure in-service education. There is a move. There are these teacher quality partnership grants at the federal level. They have shrunk in size, but they've supported some really strong partnership programs between universities and schools, residency models where you have a full year of student teaching or apprenticeship in the classroom with an expert urban teacher or whatever the location is, in a school that serves diverse students, new English learners, as well as other students who represent what our majority is today. While the coursework is wrapped around and integrated with this very strong clinical experience. And what we see when that happens is that teachers come out knowing how not only to think about these issues, but how to do the things that are needed to teach English learners with sheltered strategies or whatever the strategy may be, or it may be in a bilingual immersion. In San Francisco, there's a set of programs like this where 2 universities are working with the schools in bilingual immersion settings, training special ed, math and science teachers. Some of them are in international schools, learning these practices that are rare and need to spread so that the next generation will come in that way. But that means dramatic change in teacher education, regulation and accreditation, and all the other levers that one can apply. Because when teacher ed came into universities in the 1950s, it became very much coursework, theory, very tenuous relationships to the field, and some places have changed that. But one of the things we're doing in California, like some other states, is getting outcome data about schools of education from their graduates. Did you learn this? Were you given this? Did you get these opportunities? And from employers, can your teachers do the things that are needed? And we're going to be using that, as some other states are, in looking at universities and other providers, because districts are also authorized to provide teacher education in some cases, charter schools and so on, to say who's producing the kind of teachers that we need. Teacher performance assessments are used in our state as well that evaluate this in performance on the job. And we have to encourage universities that have not yet evolved to strong clinical practice to do so, and if they don't care to do so, to get out of the business.
I know that a bunch of you wanted to respond to that, but I just want to go to Janelle for 1 minute. I mean, we're at a point of a whole new wave of litigation on equity and on adequacy, and we're seeing the courts start to consider a lot more even aspects of pedagogy, aspects of teacher training and salaries, and more about the meat of what's going on in schools than we have ever seen before. And I wonder if you could talk a little about where you see that going and what role we could expect the courts to be able to play in this sort of equity and deeper learning discussion.
Yeah, I think that that's a tough question. I certainly think for advocates, it's important to emphasize the value of quality learning, deeper learning, and have that as a component in terms of talking about what resource equity looks like. And I really want to go back to that phrase, deeper learning is inequitably distributed, because that's such a key part. So LDF litigates a lot of cases, including one point I did want to make in terms of smaller schools. We actually did file against New York specialized high schools because they were actually excluding a lot of students, particularly students of color. And one thing I think we do have to be careful about when we are promoting great models is ensuring that we're not excluding certain students from even gaining admission or access to these great schools that are promoting that, because they do become in high demand and people want to have access to them, but we have to do it in ways that ensure broad access. So whether that's a lot of charters were concerned about some exclusionary admission policies, again, the specialized high schools in New York City, where we have litigated because it's just really an issue of lack of access to these quality learning opportunities. So we have certainly advocated and shown courts the value in terms of outcomes of being able to access these programs and elevating it. I think it's really hard to say where the courts will go in terms of weighing that. I think that that's a battle that we fought decades even before Brown, where we argued that even having equitable resources, them being separate in and of themselves was inequitable. So really emphasizing things like the value of diverse classrooms, how both students, all students of races and all races and ethnicities benefit from that. A lot of people talk about Brown versus Board of Education and the value of desegregated learning environments, diverse learning environments for African American students, but we also argued in that litigation that white students also valued, really benefited from diverse learning environments. So I think we really have to take a look at access and ensuring that we don't exclude students, and that has been a huge focus of our litigation, but also ensuring that courts understand and see the benefit, what are the long-term benefits and the long-term consequences of lack of access.
Thanks. I want to open it up. I want to continue this conversation, but I'd like to open it up in case anyone has any questions. I think there's a microphone in the back. I don't know whether it'll be brought around or, oh, and there's another one over here. So if anybody has any, while we're waiting, I know Stan wanted to respond to that.
Well, I was interested in the conversation about professional development because I agree with everybody that it's uneven in terms of the way it's distributed, but from the way people think about it, they think about it as really a high-cost option, and that you've got to provide a significant amount of money, and that there aren't the quality of people who could do mentoring or master teaching or advising, and that coursework isn't enough, and that you need to support teachers on an ongoing basis. One of the things that we've been thinking of doing, we're actually in the process of it, is using this new piece of technology called cognitive computing. You know, we used it to win the game show Jeopardy on TV, but it's not a game, believe me. We're working now with a group of oncologists at some of the best cancer hospitals in the United States to actually create an advisor for oncologists so that they have easy access to all clinical trial information, all cancer diagnostic and treatment plans converted using data analytics and natural language. And when you think about that, that can be actually a teacher advisor. And you can load into the supercomputer as much content as you can find about teaching practice, curriculum materials. You need the cooperation of people to vet it and make sure it's high quality. But then you can actually respond to individual questions that a teacher would have and have a personalized mentor or tutor using cognitive computing without asking for name, rank, and serial number and getting people nervous about teacher assessment. But that could reshape teacher professional development.
Thanks. And could you say your name and who you're with?
Yes, good morning. Ramona Eagle, and I direct the DC Charter School Association. My dear Linda, thank you so much for coming here. I'd like to point out that the experiences in California and New York are different from the experiences in DC, and we'd love to be a part of whatever data gathering and assessment you're looking at, because there's a different mix here. But the points I wanted to make had to do with underlying what Wade talked about in terms of states' rights, and underlying what Linda talked about in terms of which students get which kind of education is a very old American stigma of inferiority in race and class. And you can talk about methods all you like, but unless we finally do address that, these things will not change in terms of political will. And one of the solutions that I strongly encourage as we look at everything else is to infuse into the students themselves an understanding of who they are and what their power is, politicize them, if you like that term, so that they themselves reject that stigma, as well as the institutional framework in which they're working. It's got to start at the top, but it's also got to start at the bottom. And together, maybe we can finally eradicate that stigma, which, as long as it continues, will poison everything else that we're trying to do to some degree. The other point I wanted to make about professional development is what people have sometimes called professional learning communities help us mitigate the fact that probably each and every teacher will not be a general education teacher who also knows special education, who also knows English language learning, who also knows how to prepare students in terms of wraparound services and soft skills. But together, each one, if respected and have a power balance within that professional learning community within the school, can support each other and make up for each other's lack of specific knowledge around those things. That's what teams are for. Teams of learners and teams of teachers.
That's a lot to unpack.
Can I'd love to jump in on one issue around equity. And I want to make an argument that probably won't go over well, but I'll try it anyways, which is that in the cause of equity, that what we actually may need more of is actually more gifted and talented programs and more tracking. All right, now let me play this out. All right, it's been 30 years since Jeannie Oakes came out with her book about tracking, right? And that we've been hearing these arguments about the bad sides of tracking, and of which there were many. What happened in reaction to the anti-tracking movement, though, was that generally schools in, let's call it blue America, right, in urban systems, they got rid of gifted and talented, they got rid of tracking, they listened to Jeannie Oakes. Schools in the suburbs, maybe in red America, but especially in the more affluent suburbs, did not. So the situation we have today is that if you are poor and high achieving, you are likely attending a school in the city where there is no gifted and talented program, where there is not the ability, once you get to middle school and high school, to be in advanced tracks with other advanced students. Whereas if you are white and you are rich, you are still attending schools in the suburbs or private schools where you have gifted and talented programs, where you have those advanced courses, where you have that tracking. I understand the impulse to say, let's get rid of it everywhere, okay? But for 30 years, that argument has not won the day in the more affluent parts of this country. And so the argument is, what can we do for the high-achieving, low-income kids and high-achieving kids of color who are denied this opportunity that they would not be denied if they were affluent and living in the suburbs? And I think that is another way of looking at this equity issue for your consideration.
Mike, can I get a follow? I have to do a follow-up on this.
Yes.
There are, as you said, gifted and talented programs and advanced curriculums in the suburbs,
Yeah.
which the low-income and students of color in those schools still don't have access
Right.
to.
Right.
So what have you found
Right.
to change the policies and practices of systemic and often
Yep.
unconscious racism
Right.
or
No,
socioeconomic
great
bias?
question. I mean, first of all, look, I am acknowledging what is a terrible truth in this country, first of all, is that many of our schools are still very segregated, right? So in a lot of those suburban schools, there aren't that many poor and minority kids, right? And in the urban schools I'm talking about, there aren't that many white and affluent kids, okay? So, I mean, you know, it's one thing when you're talking about diverse schools. It's another thing when you have the de facto segregation we still have in a lot of places. All right. The other issue is look at what's happened in New York City, for example. The current policy for gifted and talented is they have one cut score for what it takes to be gifted and talented across the city. And not surprisingly, in the much more affluent areas, in the Upper East Side, there's lots more kids getting into those programs. A different way to say, instead, let's say take a top 10% route. Let's say at every individual elementary school, we're in some kind of measure, we're going to identify the top 10% of kids and make sure that they have access to special programs. And that would be a way to get lots more poor and minority kids opportunities for acceleration, for et cetera, that they would not otherwise have.
This is such a big topic that we could spend more time than we have, but I just want to offer one thought. First of all, that's how they used to do gifted and talented in New York City pre-Bloomberg, so
Yeah.
we can go back to
Yeah.
another time. But the real issue is, I remember when I fought to get my own kids in those programs because the curriculum was different, right? And you go to back to school night and the teachers would say, this is where we give your kids, we teach them to think. And I always would say, well, what are you doing in the rest of the programs? And the real question is, why do we deny access to a thinking
Absolutely.
curriculum
Right.
to kids
Absolutely.
in every classroom?
Totally agreed,
right?
totally agreed.
And so we're on
Totally
the same
agreed.
page.
Can I just say one-
And I
just
think
say
Common
one
Core
thing?
helps, right? I mean,
Can I
that's-
just say one thing, though? We can't ignore, to the comment that was just made, the role of race in this. It's not accidental why certain children ended up where they did.
Right.
It's deliberate placement. And years prior, decades prior to filing Brown versus Board of Education, there was a lot of debate whether we focus on access to quality resources or we focus on integration and diversity. And so we know what the ultimate decision was, but we can't ignore the intentionality and, as you noted, the institutionalized and systemic racism that continues to fuel the policies and practices that we see today. That's really at bottom what it's about, and that's what we're trying to dismantle. Again, we filed litigation against the specialized high schools because certain students were not getting access to them. You can walk in the doors of many New York City schools, and even though students of all races are in the same building, there's still essentially segregated. You walk in one classroom and another classroom, and it looks like segregation is still very much alive. That's very intentional. When certain students have access to the means to prepare for these entrance exams to certain schools or to get access and tutoring in order to succeed, and we can't ignore that.
Well, the
wanna
fact of the matter is,
I want to get one more question in because we've got, and I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. This will stay in that same context. So my name is Robin Enns. I'm with the National Urban League. I am going to invite you all to let me speak not with the National Urban League hat necessarily. I am from Kansas. My parents, grandparents, and people who came before them were all educated in a segregated high school that prided itself on excellence, that was named after Charles Sumner. I know he has a space here or there's a building here named after him. What I grew up in Kansas City was a focus on academic excellence. The principals, the doctors, the lawyers all lived within our community because it was segregated. I'm a child born in 1968. I stand on the excellence that came out of that school and the belief that everyone in that building had to be educated. We did not have the luxury of not educating some of our children because that was the way out. What I am struggling with as I approach my 50th year is that I think we lost something with Brown versus Board of Education, and I think you spoke on it. We got integration, we lost access. We lost access to information, we lost access to tools, things were reconfigured, and folks were left out who don't have access. What is happening in suburban schools now, in which I live, is that young people who are black and brown and lack social capital are not getting access to information about the strong classes in the schools. They're not necessarily called gifted and talented, but there may be math classes and after-school programs that are only for those kids who are really, really strong or whose parents fight. There are classes that are given in the summers before school starts that are for young people whose parents are fighting for them to get in or are deemed as really smart by the teachers who only believe in those few children but don't believe every child can learn. That is what is happening in the suburbs in New Jersey, and I would posit to you it's happening around the country. Black, brown, and under-resourced kids who lack social capital aren't even given the chance to get access to those strong classes. That is what is happening across America. My question to you is, how, when are we going to demand and support educators in believing that all children have the ability to learn? What can be done to ensure that? Because other than that, we're going to continue to parse our children into those who have access to opportunity and those who have access to just pushing a widget.
Thanks.
What can we do?
Have any of you, if any of you have had experience specifically with ways that break down those kinds of barriers and create better access for students to better courses?
So there are some examples of how we can address this, and I think it requires real leadership at the district level and with the principals to acknowledge that the problem exists and that they have to take the steps to address it. So what I've seen is in Federal Way in Washington, they have a fantastic policy that was put in place by the administrators, which is an opt-out policy for their AP courses. So they use a regular cut score, and then they say anybody who has, who's above that cut score automatically is enrolled in an advanced placement course. They have to actively go in, talk to a counselor, and be counseled in terms of why they do not want to be enrolled. And so a lot of students, Hispanic, African American students who may not have realized that they were AP quality students are getting enrolled. Now the school and district has put in place also the wraparound and support services for these students so that they get supported in terms of study habits, taking an advanced course, all the different things that are needed to help them with succeeding in these classes because they never had access before. And so I think, you can look at those sort of policies and think about replicating that and demanding that across the country. Because why are we tracking students and deciding who gets access and who doesn't? Right? We should be trying to figure out how we support it so that more students can actually get into the class.
And Patricia, I'll give you the final word.
Well, I'm going to let Linda have the final word, but maybe I just have to, this is like burning, okay? I have to say something. Because we're talking as though we got integration, and we didn't.
Yeah.
Okay? We got some integration in the South, and the South is turning back. The rest of the country is increasingly segregated, and we sort of talk around it and past it without really discussing how do we equally distribute the resources of schooling when our schools are so incredibly segregated in themselves. So I know I have to hand this back to you for the final word, but we need once again a renewal of the curriculum, the equal status curriculum. What we haven't talked about is what peers learn from peers, which is incredibly important. If you sit next to the kid in class whose parents know something about how to get to college, if you sit next to the kid who has these kinds of aspirations, you're going to learn that whether your teacher tells you or not, and probably won't. We have got to face up to the incredible segregation that is going on and that the courts have continually helped to foster more and more. Before, I think we can really believe that we're going to have equitable outcomes for all of our children.
And yes. And I just will add a footnote to the comments that were made. I have worked with a number of schools that have detracked and that have also created in segregated settings or all students of color and low-income student settings, deeper learning curricula for all the kids, where with great heterogeneity. And a part of that is the policy that not only says you can opt out above a certain score, you have to opt out above, but says you can opt in from anywhere, but it's also teacher development. And I used that little example earlier about teachers not being able to carry that curriculum in that situation in Montgomery County, but it wasn't because they didn't want to or couldn't have ultimately done it. It's because they got a couple of days of drive-by, spray and pray workshops that were not adequate to enable them over time to learn a new way of teaching. And these deeper learning skills require a very different kind of pedagogy. How do you teach for inquiry? How do you keep the content solid? And we've had the curriculum wars between Back to the Basics and project-based learning. And if either is done badly, then kids suffer. When the skills are brought together with the content and the inquiry in a sophisticated, careful way, kids benefit. That requires we invest a lot more in the capacity of teachers to learn that pedagogy. And as you noted, we have a generation of teachers who have not really had that kind of training because they were being trained for a different kind of teaching and learning. So at the end of the day, yes, we have to fight the battles to return to integrated settings, heterogeneous settings where kids can learn together with teachers who are skilled and leaders who understand the policy framework to allow that to happen.
Join me in thanking our panel. And I'm going to bring up Charmaine to do the closing remarks.
Good to meet you. Yeah, likewise, Stan. I can't believe that's never happened before. No, then again,
Well, thank you, everyone. And I would ask again if you could please join me in giving a round of applause to our presenters, panelists, and moderator. Each of them did an exceptional job of discussing the importance of deeper learning and equity and the policies needed to realize these ideals, as Wade Henderson referred to earlier. One couple quick housekeeping notes, because I want to be very respectful of your time, because we've went a little over time, but this was a great conversation. The video from today's event will be available next week on the Learning Policy Institute's website. And I would also strongly encourage you, if you have not done so already, to please visit JFF's website. They have an entire series of reports that are dedicated to deeper learning, looking at various kind of thematic issues, all of them very important. I really would encourage you to take a look at the entire series. Thank you again for joining us. Please stay tuned. Check out the LPI website for our upcoming work. And again, thank you for your commitment for coming out on a Friday morning to have this conversation. Thank you.